Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video here at Whiteboard Medicine. Hope you're having a good day. Today is going to be another video within our series of videos on end-tidal capnography, or end-tidal CO2. Specifically today we're going to be talking about end-tidal capnographic tracings for hyperventilation and hypoventilation. For those of you new to the channel, we are the Whiteboard Medicine channel. This is our homepage here. We do medical education and medical news. We are coming out with a series of videos on end-tidal capnography. We'll link them in this video's description on our channel. Though if you go to playlist, you can either go to pulmonology or critical care. You can see two here. We have a few more being posted. This is the introduction video on end-tidal capnography, particularly waveform analysis basics. If you're new to end-tidal capnography, we would recommend you start with this video because it'll give you kind of the setup for how to understand the rest of the videos today. If you are familiar already with end-tidal capnography and you're just looking for hyperventilation, hypoventilation, this is the video for you. In addition to that, last shout out, we do have a Whiteboard Medicine Patreon page, both free and paid memberships, where we post all of our video outlines, commercial-free videos, interesting articles, practice questions. So check that out. We'll link it in the video's description. We'd love for you to join and be part of that Whiteboard Medicine Patreon community. No further ado, quick 30-second break for the introduction, then we will dive in.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Whiteboard Medicine. We appreciate you checking out the video. Here at Whiteboard Medicine, our goal is to create medical education content for all types of interested learners. That includes videos, practice questions, study resources, and much more. We would love for you to join our community by subscribing, hit that bell button. We're also working to build a high-yield Patreon page. It's going to be full of practice questions, video outlines, notes, commercial-free content, and much more.
None of these videos are intended to be acted upon as medical advice. Please pause the video here and read this disclaimer in its entirety before moving on.
All right, thanks for sticking around. So end-tidal capnography, particularly in regards to hyperventilation and hypoventilation. This here is a normal end-tidal capnographic waveform. You have time on the x-axis, carbon dioxide on the y-axis, and you get this kind of square waveform, right? And this waveform has both inhalatory areas and exhalatory areas. The exhalation has four different phases, 0 through 3, that represent different anatomic areas of the respiratory anatomy that goes from dead space to mixed air to alveolar air, and then it gives you the final peak here, which is the end-tidal carbon dioxide. Again, if this is unfamiliar to you, definitely check out that video linked in this video's description, the basics, because we're not going to do a deep dive on what all these mean in this video. Rather, we're going to talk about abnormalities in the waveform, so interpreting abnormal waveforms. If we scroll down, we have three different waveforms here, right? All of them are on the same scale, carbon dioxide, as compared to time, but they have three different shapes to them. This here would be what we consider the normal waveform, right? You get dead space that then is mixed air into your alveolar air, which is where it plateaus here, into this peak, which is the end-tidal CO2. And then you start exhaling, it goes right back down to 0 until it goes again. Each peak is about at the same height, and it correlates with what is the end-tidal CO2, and let's just say it's 40 millimeters of mercury. So this is a normal waveform. Again, we dove into the specifics in that previous video. These are two abnormal waveforms, right? 1, 2. And they're abnormal because the morphology of the capnography is different. One is different, both of them are different for two different reasons. One of those reasons is respiratory rate, right? So this one has a faster respiratory rate. Each one of these is a breath. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 breaths up here. Down here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 breaths. And then the respiratory rate on this one is slower, right? You have 1, 2, 3 breaths. So the respiratory rate is different in these. The duration of the breath, this is time, right? This is duration of breath, is different too, right? This duration of breath is shorter. Let's just make up a time thing. We'll say this is 5, this one's shorter, this is 3, this one's longer, this one's 8. So the duration of the breath is shorter. And then the peak of the breath is different. These are all universal peaks, whereas this one downtrends, this one uptrends. Now, if we break these up and think about what this means. So if I were to categorize this tracing, we'd say it's got an increased respiratory rate, okay, a shorter exhalation time, and the CO2 decreases over time, right? Because that's what the peak is. The peak here, each one of these is the end tidal CO2. So we're just making things up. This one's 40, then this one's 37, then this one's 32, maybe this one's 29, 25, etc., etc. So the end tidal is decreasing. And if we were to typify that into a particular breathing pattern, someone is tachypnic, shorter exhalation time, you might describe it as breathing more shallow, and their carbon dioxide is decreasing over time. That would describe someone who is, drum roll, hyperventilating, right? Let's say they're anxious, having a panic attack, and they're right, they're breathing faster, each breath is shorter. And over time, since they're breathing faster, their CO2 is going to decrease because they're hyperventilating, they're tachypnic. Their carbon dioxide levels, they're clearing them more quickly. Now let's go down to this other tracing. This tracing, if we were to describe it, has fewer respiration, so a decreased respiratory rate, RR respiratory rate. It has a prolonged exhalation time, and the CO2 is increasing over time. If we were to describe this pattern, and maybe y'all are going to figure this out by now, because the title implies what we're talking about, right? Breathing slower, prolonged breaths, and the carbon dioxide actually building up over time. This would be hypoventilation. Right? Hypoventilation is when you're breathing hypo. Hypo is lower ventilating or slower. So what's happening here is you're taking less breaths and you're kind of taking longer breaths. And over time, since you're taking less breaths, you are actually building up carbon dioxide. So, if this one's 40, this next end tidal might be 48. This next one might be 55. You're hypoventilating. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is there's a lot of variability to these things, right? There's a scenario of hypoventilation where your breaths are not longer, so it might look like this, right? Instead of blue, they're not any longer. You're just taking fewer breaths, and you're building up over time because the duration of the breath might not be longer depending on what's going on. Same thing with hyperventilation. The duration of the breath might not be any longer. You're just taking more of them over time, if that makes sense. So that is something that can be different between these two tracers. And the pathology can drive differences as well, right? If you are sedated, let's say that you overdosed on an opiate, so you're hypoventilating, this is probably what it'll look like, right? Let's say you're having a panic attack, so you're hyperventilating, this is probably what it looks like. But let's say you're tachypnic, which is not the same as hyperventilation. You're tachypnic because you have something like a metabolic acidosis, so you're trying to breathe off all that acid. The morphology is going to be different. So these are kind of organic hyperventilation and hypoventilation. Hypoventilation can be helpful if you're doing something like, let's say you're doing procedural sedation. Actually, let's get a thinner marker so we can read what we're saying here. You're doing something like procedural sedation, and you give someone propofol for their procedural sedation. You have them on end tidal, and you see a morphology that looks like this, or a morphology that, as we talked about, doesn't have this prolonged phase. It's kind of like this. This implies that they're breathing a few times, right? And that they're hypoventilating and they're building up carbon dioxide. And that's an important thing to know in procedural sedation. You might have to do jaw thrust, you might have to cut things short, you might have to bag them a little bit. Let's say someone comes in and they're tachypnic and tachycardic and sweaty and they look panicked, and you put them on end tidal and this is what it looks like. They're probably hyperventilating, and why they're hyperventilating is a different question. But this is how these two can be helpful. Hyperventilation, hypoventilation. They're also two commonly talked about capnographic waveforms. So hopefully that was helpful. Let us know what thoughts, comments, questions you have down below. Check out those other capnography videos or any of our additional videos. We have a lot of medical education content out there. Subscribe, hit the bell button, check out that Patreon page, all that good stuff. Stay well, keep learning. We'll see you next time.